Hello, everybody. My name is Avrami Gurari, and I feel privileged and honored to participate in this Unite to Heal event for Amudim. I am here with my brother. I'm in New York. I'm here with my brother, Michal Gurari, Rabbi Michal Gurari in Australia. First, a little something about me and why I'm here, and then we'll talk about my brother just a little bit. Unfortunately, we tragically lost our daughter a year ago on December 22nd, Zion Tavis, and she struggled with an eating disorder and depression, and unfortunately, she took her life a year ago. She was 24 years old. Her name is Yocheved. And as a result of that experience, even before that, since my daughter was so public about her struggles, we were public as well, our family. And after her passing, things intensified, where I took on more of a activist role, if you want, in the field of mental health. So here we are talking to my brother, Rabbi Michal Gurari in Sydney, Australia. My brother Michal is the founder and director of Bina in Sydney, Australia, which is a large organization dedicated to adult Jewish education. He was born in South Africa, as I was, and educated in the US and Australia. He is a passionate educator and speaker. He lectures on a wide range of topics, with a special emphasis on personal growth and self-development from a Jewish Torah perspective. Michal, can you tell us anything else about you, that kind of work you're involved in? Anything that I left out, background about yourself and your work in Australia?
Well, thank you. First of all, it's great to be interviewed by my own brother. And I just want to acknowledge the work that you've been doing over the last year in the context of your own painful journey, but with tremendous strength. And also want to just say that it's just an honor to be part of the Amudim event and the organization, and thank them for inviting me to be part of this. So yeah, Bina started about 25 years ago, and its main purpose was to provide Jewish education for the very broad spectrum of the Jewish community here in Sydney. But we've developed a stream over the years focusing specifically on personal growth, character development, which has evolved in so many different ways, raising awareness to do with issues to do with parenting, and also helping people and educating people in the area of mental health and supporting them through their journey, which I suppose is what brings us here today.
All right. Thank you. So let's get right into it. Amudim is an organization that focuses on responding to a whole wide range of mental health issues. What is your involvement in the area of mental health? Are you just a rabbi? Just a rabbi that helps out, or are you a qualified counselor or therapist?
Okay, so I'm definitely not a qualified therapist. I'm not a counselor. I am just a rabbi that enjoys and is involved and has read extensively on psychological issues, but I understand my role, and my role is just a rabbi. But I do help many people in a counseling capacity from a rabbi perspective. Never pretend to be a substitute for any critical and necessary intervention, but helping people through their journey. I believe that there's a puzzle, and the puzzle has a number of different pieces to it. Therapists, parents, medical professionals, and so on and so forth. But that puzzle, I think, needs to include a rav, a mashpia, a mentor, however you want to describe it, someone that's there to help and support people with a Torah perspective and a Torah outlook, which I think is very critical. And I want to just say, I suppose in our discussion now, I'm going to share things from my perspective and my experience here in Sydney. I suspect that it's not very different around the world, but I'm not that familiar with what happens other places. But I can share a little bit of my experience here working with people over the last 25 years.
Thank you. Next question. So focusing specifically on your rabbinic role, what is the role of a rabbi in a mental health crisis or challenge, and how does that go together with regular therapy or other interventions? And I want to just add to that, because there seems to be some kind of confusion in the frum world. Who does one go to first? Do you go to your rabbi first? Do you go to a psychologist first, your psychiatrist? What is the role of the rabbi? Where does it start? Where does it stop? Let's talk about that just a little bit.
So that's a great question. So very often actually people do come to the rabbi first, and that's my experience, particularly with people who I have a relationship with.
Do you think that's a good thing?
Sorry?
Do you think that's a good thing? Where should they go? You tell me what they do actually do, but where should they go first?
So I'm not sure. I'm just dealing with the reality, and the fact is that sometimes they feel supported. I think they feel the rabbi is someone they're familiar with, they're comfortable with, they feel safe with, perhaps, if they already have a relationship, or they know someone that has a relationship with me, for example, and therefore they will very often come, sometimes not expecting that I will actually direct them somewhere else. But I will say sometimes people come to a rabbi thinking the rabbi is the last stop and they will be able to provide the solution, which isn't the case. They can certainly help, they can be part of the journey, but they won't be able to provide the solution. So let's just break it down a little bit, if that's okay. So I think it's fair to say mental health is very, very complex, with so many different components that work together, affecting each other. And of course, every case is different. Now, we know that sometimes there are purely physiological imbalance issues that require medical intervention. Sometimes there's deep emotional issues which require particular expertise, particular qualifications, professionals, and also something that can be ongoing. I don't even in a rabbi counseling position, I'll stay with a person throughout the journey, but I don't offer, I should say, ongoing counseling, and nor does any Rav, I think. But nevertheless, I think a Rav or a mentor, mashpia, can be incredibly helpful on a number of levels. So let me just give you a couple of examples. First of all, sometimes it's the authority that helps. I'll give you an example. Just now, I'm dealing with a family who clearly needs to go for grief counseling that I cannot provide. I don't have the expertise. It needs to be someone that really is good, and it's a really serious situation. But I now, through a friend and through discussion, they've agreed to go, but only if they speak to me first, and I will support them going to that form of therapy. So I'll be in that position to direct them in the right direction, right? Another example of where the rabbi comes into the team and he's part of the journey is halachic guidance. Sometimes you need to assure a family or a patient where it's okay to be makel, okay to be lenient, okay to do different things. It might be Yom Kippur with eating disorders. It might be not doing certain mitzvahs when it comes to obsessive
Kashrus with eating disorders, right?
I'm sorry?
Kashrus and eating disorders as well.
Kashrus and eating disorders, when exactly it might be not doing certain mitzvahs when it comes to obsession, OCD, for example. And part of that direction is not just giving the psak, but it's also supporting him and removing the guilt and removing the uncertainty about, you know, what will happen if I do this, and are you sure it's okay, and things like that. And sometimes the therapist is not able to do that because they don't have the halachic or spiritual authority where the Rav can. I think also most importantly probably is that the rabbi needs to create a partnership. I think a partnership with the therapist, the parents, a partnership with the rest of the team, and that partnership affects many different areas. For example, culture, right? Often, especially here in Australia, we don't have a lot of religious therapists, for example. Often the therapist doesn't understand the culture of the family, doesn't understand the values of the family. Just recently, I dealt with a case, to give you an example, which for me, it was clear that it was against Torah values, where someone was having, someone who's married having problems with their parents, you know, realizing that the parents sort of didn't provide the right positive parenting that they would have wished for, and so on and so forth. And there was tension and conflict. And the therapists, very much in line with a lot of modern society sort of perspective, was guiding this particular woman on breaking off ties with her parents, or putting very strict conditions with her mother, and if they don't keep those conditions, cutting her out completely, which I'm completely convinced that that's against Torah. It's against Torah values, and it's completely unhealthy.
And you told them.
And I did tell them, and I will tell them, and I will continue to tell them that I think that's, now there can be boundaries, there can be modified relationships, and so on and so forth, depending on the case, but it's not healthy for them, and it's not healthy for their own children. And sometimes what will happen is that their own children respond to them the way they're responding to their parents. And therefore, that's kind of the cultural or halachic religious perspective that the rabbi can bring to the team if they're working together with the therapist or with the counselor. The role of the rabbi also is overall well-being, including just bringing in a ruchnistic, a spiritual component to the whole journey.
You seem to be describing a utopian process, the way it should be, what the contribution of the rabbi is, and the contribution of the therapist. What if there's resistance? What if the patient decides either you're right and they're wrong? Both of these scenarios are not good scenarios. So, for example, they'll only take your advice as opposed to the therapist, or they'll say to you, the therapist is right and you're wrong. Is there a point where you kind of get off the bus and you say, I no longer take responsibility rabbinically in this case, and we have to part ways at this point?
Yeah, sometimes. So what I will often do is, if I really feel that a person needs the assistance and the support of a professional, I will be very clear that my role is limited, and I'm not prepared. I mean, I'm always prepared to talk to a person. I'm always prepared to be nice to a person and support them, but I'll be very clear about the support that I can and cannot give. And if I think it's particularly in cases where it's physically or emotionally or psychologically dangerous, I'll be very clear either to the person or their family that my responsibility ends, because I'm not prepared to support through a process if the team isn't complete. And what I will often encourage people to do is to actually give permission to a professional to talk to me so that it can actually create a team. And I've often had discussions with therapists on the phone about a particular case, with permission, of course, because that's the laws and so on. But where creating that team and respect, mutual respect for each other, becomes very beneficial. So just to give you like another example of a role, I think, sometimes it's very important for a role also to add, together with the journey of therapy or professional intervention, that sort of ruchnistic and meaningful aspect as a support, and to get advice. By the way, the relationship is mutual. It's not only I tell the therapist what the culture is, they tell me also what is beneficial and what isn't beneficial, right? So that I know the limitations of my role. But having said that, so just to share with you, Avoid, often what happens is people let go of toxic stuff, or they let go of stuff that they've been involved in. But then what? They create a vacuum, and that vacuum could attract other negative things. So there has to be that sort of synthesis. There has to be that combination. And often the role of the Rav is the role of the therapist is to help the person let go of toxicity. But what is it going to be filled with? What's that void going to be filled with? And maybe sometimes that's the role of the Rav. And that sort of combination is very important. In the writings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who wrote extensively in response to people who sought advice for emotional turmoil or anxiety or other mental health issues. And when it was mild, the Rebbe would give spiritual advice, but very often in letters, the Rebbe would advise people to seek advice and seek intervention. The Rebbe would always create this like combination between three things. One was seeking professional advice and following the doctor's orders and following the therapist's orders and so on and so forth. The other was purely spiritual support, like checking a mezuzah or increasing in kashrus or whatever the case was. And then often it was also about studying and engaging in meaningful things like chesed or strengthening bitochen or emunah and things like that. So there's that partnership which we find on many levels, which is so important.
Thank you. Mental health, illness, and challenges seem to be on the rise in the last number of decades. I can tell you that I researched this after Yechavid passed away, that the suicide rate is actually, documented. So I think since 2004, like the last 16 years, have gone up about 60% in young adults, mostly women. Is this just a fact of life? Can it be slowed down or prevented? In other words, is prevention even a possibility? Now, let me just add to that. We have to treat mental health in its acute and chronic stages. At the same time, we have to prevent the very kind of lifestyle choices or life choices that people make that may perhaps bring to these, present with these problems. You're correct what you said earlier, that there's also a possibility of some chemical things going on, but let's say there's environmental issues. So what's more important, prevention or cure, or both? And are we giving enough? I think that we're not giving enough attention to prevention in the very early stages of life. And we could even go before that, parenting, before you even have a child. Maybe, someone should, each couple should go for training on how to be a good parent. So let's speak about that a little bit.
So yeah, there's a lot of different aspects of your question, but first of all, I have to agree with you. I think the world is amazing in response to crisis. There are so many different organizations responding to crisis, trying to fix crises, trying to intervene into crises, and so on and so forth. And not nearly enough thought or resources or thinking is given to prevention. So I don't claim to be an expert, but let me tell you what I've discussed with others and sort of my perspective on the whole concept of prevention. So first of all, just to echo and just to emphasize the point that you made that I referenced earlier, I like to look at this as, to give an analogy of physical illness, right? Physical illness, unfortunately, for ways that we don't understand, mistorim darke Hashem, we don't always understand the ways of Hashem, can strike anything. Anyone can die from a heart attack, God forbid. Anyone can die from cancer, no matter how fit or healthy they might be, right? However, the pasuk does tell us one should live in a healthy way, because we know that although it's not always preventable, or no, it's not always possible, and to prevent illness, and illness can strike any family, any environment, any stage of a person's life, and so on and so forth. But we do know that living a healthy life minimizes risk of physical illness, right? If you live a healthy life, you're less, if you eat healthy or if you do exercise, you're less likely to get a heart attack. Simply put, doesn't guarantee, but it's less likely. So I think the same is with mental illness. I think that, as you say, sometimes it's a pure illness that could be genetic, it could be given by God in whatever way, whatever form, whatever context, and whatever you do in the best family, the best environment, the best resource, the best education, it will still strike. But having said that, there are ways to live healthy, and there are ways definitely to prevent. And I think there's many things happening in our society today that is exacerbating and definitely contributing to the increase of mental illness, anxiety, depression, and so many other forms of illness. One of the people who I like listening to, who I would consider, and I've spoken to many times, or I consider somewhat of a mentor, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying that, is Dr. Pelcovitz. And there's an expression that he uses that I've used many times. When he talks about depression, he talks about depression with a small d or depression with a big D. And I've kind of extended that to anxiety, like anxiety with a small a or anxiety with a big A.
Well,
what that means is
trauma with a big T and
trauma with a big T, trauma with a small t, exactly. So the difference between these things when a small letters or big letters is that depression with a big D or trauma with a big T or anxiety with a big A means that it's bad enough and it's clinical and it's really sort of out of the control of the person, and the person needs support, right? It's not that the person has a choice anymore so much. They have a choice to get help, but they don't have a choice to help themselves. They need other people to support their help. However, very often the two get blurred a little bit, and very often every person, I would say, or lots of people, most people, go through stages of their life where there's at least depression with a small d or anxiety with a small a. I mean, we're Jewish, right? Anxiety is part of our DNA. We worry a lot, and so on and so forth, or we suffer a little bit of trauma, or people looked at us the wrong way, and so on and so forth. And I think sometimes we lack the skill, or our children lack the skill, to deal with the stuff on the small d or the small a or the small t. And if we don't deal with it properly, what can happen is, I think it can evolve into the big D and the big A, where it's a bit late already, where it needs a whole nother response and a whole nother intervention. And then it's already a response to a crisis. So I think what we do need to do is we do need to put a lot of effort, and I think particularly when our children are young, to build strong people, right? Part of that is building a healthy mind. We know that, and particularly a lot of modern psychology, a lot of positive psychology, for example, is very much based on the way the mind interprets what is happening around us. Cognitive behavioral therapy is based on that. A lot of therapies are based on using the positivity of the mind, or using reframing, or using the way we interpret the mind to control the way we feel. So mental weakness or mental struggle often happens in the heart. In other words, more emotional than cognitive, but nevertheless, it is driven by cognition, it is driven by the way we think. Now, although this is very much a part of modern positive psychology, but it's an old Torah concept. The book of Tanya, for example, is completely based on the simple principle of moyach shalit al halev, that the brain rules the heart. The way we think will determine ultimately, or at least influence, the way we feel. So I think we know that building a strong mind is so important. I just recently, I do a personal growth class every Thursday, and I do it in series of 6 weeks. And recently I just gave a series based on a secular book called 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. And it's all about the mind. It's all about the perception. It's all about your perspective. It's all about the way you think about what people have done, what people have said, the reason things have happened, the reason things have happened to you, the way you respond to them, and so on and so forth. So I think prevention has a lot to do with how we bring up children, really, with the proper values, the Torah values, building strong, to put it in summary, building strong minds, building people who are mentally strong to be able to deal with challenge to emotion that comes later on. Will it always help? Of course not. But I think a lot of it can be done, which could then definitely slow it down if it's done in the right way, with the right perspective, with the right values.
So let's talk a couple of examples, because this may be easier, I would think, on the surface, to talk to a teenager or a young adult, explain about Moch Shalta Alev and so on. But there have to be subtle, for instances, in very young children, 4 or 5 years old. Let's talk about a couple of examples that are not good as a parent, and conversely, what is a positive parenting step?
Okay, so I think at every stage of parenting, this will manifest itself in a different way, right? But I think we also know that the formative years of a person is critical. That's when we shape the minds and the perspectives of our children. Modern education will tell us also that the impact of children, even before they're born, has an effect on what will happen later. So I think we probably need to raise awareness and talk more about how parents are building the minds and the hearts of children from a very, very young age in a Torah context. To summarize it, I think we need to help people or raise awareness with people and give them the ability as parents and as educators, not just parents, but teachers as well, to build, let me just summarize this. I think to build strong, healthy, resilient children who will pursue meaning and purpose in their life, right? Now, let's just summarize how that happens, I think. I mean, there's not one answer for every question, but this is the way I like to look at it. There are two things that will do this as parents and as educators, right? And these two things, unfortunately, people often view as being two opposite concepts or mutually exclusive, and they're not. They're actually critically important to be and to work together. And I'm going to use a sort of a Kabbalistic formula, which talks about the primary emotions of a person. And I'm going to use two words which I need to clarify and explain. The two words are chesed and gevura, which are often mistranslated as kindness or which is chesed, and gevura, which is often translated as harshness or severity, which is not true. What I mean by more by chesed and gevura is chesed is the whole concept of love and acceptance, where gevura is the concept of firmness or assertiveness, right?
Accountability.
So the truth, sorry?
Or accountability.
Or accountability, right? So the truth is, these two concepts are actually critical in all relationships, right? Even in marriage, for example, right? We know that love is the glue of relationships, but respect, which often actually is a gevura idea, which means it's holding back, giving the person space, creating boundaries, what is okay to say, what is not okay to say, which is much more of a gevura thing, is also important. That's a gevura concept, and that's important in all relationships. But when it comes to parenting, however, I always say that parenting, and it's important for parents to understand this, when you start parenting, it's actually not just about your children. It's about a new critical stage in your own personal growth. Because when you parent, you suddenly realize, or you should realize, or hopefully will realize, that parenting needs parents to have two opposite emotional approaches working at the same time, right? Which is difficult because most people have a disposition to one or the other. So what I mean by that in summary is the following. So first of all, there's got to be chesed and gevura working together. What I mean by that briefly is this. Chesed means if you want to build strong children, they need to grow up in a safe environment. They need to grow up in a loving environment. So there's got to be unconditional love. Unconditional love means that whatever your child is going to do or be or say, he or she remains your child. It is your child that you have to just accept and love whatever happens. You need to express that love. We need to create a positive environment of warmth, of calmness, of happiness, of fun even. We need to nurture the relationships with our children. We need to accept the individuality of our children, right? That will build each child in their own way. Every child is different. We get to decide the values, but they are each different from each other and will express those values a bit differently. We need to build communication. We need to build tolerance. It needs to be open communication. At the same time, we need to give children the safety of having boundaries, predictability, articulated boundaries, sometimes firmness, sometimes even consequence, all done in the context of warmth and respect and positivity. But parents need to be able to parent to build strong children. We know that if one of those two things are missing, the parenting model falls apart. The children do not feel safe. I often tell parents the children that find it, that challenge the discipline the most, are the ones that are actually craving for it. Children want structure. Children want direction. Children want values. They just don't know how to articulate it. They challenge it. They test it, but they do want that, right? So those two concepts has to be, that's as a foundation. Now, what that leads to, or what that needs to lead to, is that has to be the vehicle, that has to be the formula through which we teach values to our children. I'm talking about particularly Torah values, many of which unfortunately go against modern trends. And I'll give you a couple of examples, right?
Give me an example for a child that's 4 years old.
That's a great question. A child that's 4 years old. So we live today in a very me world, right? To use a beautiful expression from Rabbi Sachs, that the society has moved away from we to me, right? And he says we have to reverse that. What society has done is given people an amazing sense of entitlement. We live in a generation of entitlement. As we say in Yiddish, alt kommt mir, right? That's the perspective. Now we need to give and shower our children with many things and love, but the way we get rid of that sense of entitlement, which is evil and bad and selfish and Hepech HaTorah for sure, and ultimately builds tremendous weakness and unnecessary vulnerability, because then as soon as I don't get what I want, I fall apart. It starts from 4 years old. It starts from delayed gratification. It starts from boundaries. It starts with, in a loving way. It doesn't have to be in a strict, harsh, screaming way, but it starts with training children that even at 4 years old, you don't need to get whatever you want when you want, right? And so on and so forth. So that's a great example. And that starts from very, very young age. It starts from certain boundaries. It starts from things, again, not handed down in a harsh way, but there's certain things that are acceptable and certain things that aren't acceptable. Things like control, talking about, and again, this also starts from 4 years old. Maybe a child doesn't understand it on that level, but as they start to get older, talking about the fact that we don't control everything, talking about bitochen and emunah and surrendering to Hashem. The things we say to children at 3 or 4 years old has an effect. As they get older, training them, and this is a big one. The me world that we live in also breeds a lot of victimhood. I just want to share with you, in Australia at the moment, there was just recently a person passed away. His name was Eddie Jaku, a Holocaust survivor. He passed away over 100. He wrote a book, I think when he was 100 already, or close to it. He wrote a book called The Happiest Man on Earth. He had this thing where he crowned himself with the title of being the happiest man on earth. And he wrote, it's a beautiful book and it's worth reading. It's not a particularly Torah book, but it's just an amazing story where he refused to walk. He had gone through the Holocaust, the horrors of the Holocaust, and yet refused to hate, refused to blame, refused to be a victim, essentially, right? He had a reason to be a victim, a legitimate reason to be a victim, but nevertheless chose not to.
I want to come back to the 5-year-old.
Please.
Because I think these are all very lofty academic concepts, but as the Rebbe said, that Rashi is for Ben Chamish Mikra, right? That a 5-year-old can understand the Chumash or the Rashi, right?
Rashi, yeah, Rashi.
Okay, so these are all technical things and they all make a lot of sense. But how do you, for example, if you want to say no to a 5-year-old, how can you say it in such a way that the 5-year-old will understand that it's for their own well-being, and that not because the parent wants control, but rather I'm saying no for your own well-being because I love you, because I want you to be a good person. How would a 5-year-old understand that? I want this candy. No, you can't have it. And here's why. Explain to a 5-year-old.
So my view is that not always you have to explain. It's how you do it. Children have a different way of communication, very young children. Maybe as they get older and they ask you why, it's good to explain. But actually, my parenting theory is that you don't always have to answer the question why. But what you do have to do is your language, your body language, both your explicit language and the way of your demeanor. And this, I'm coming back to the chesed and gvura thing. So when you say no, like when you want to train a 5-year-old, I'm using that example, right? But it's about the broader context of creating strength and self-control and personal responsibility. When you want to explain to a child that not everything you want now you have to get, it's not about explaining. It's about saying, no, you can't have it, or you could have it later. But it's the way you say it. It's if you say it with firmness and with love, the child picks up on it. They might cry, they might even throw a tantrum, and that's fine. As long as you don't come down harsh, as long as it doesn't become about you. As soon as a parent screams and shouts, it's about them, it's not about the child. Now, we're not perfect, we do that sometimes, we all make mistakes, that's fine, but I'm talking about in theory, right? We should say no, and we should be parents and not be scared, but we need to do it with love. It should be not about us, and not about what we want, and not about because it's good for us. It's about the well-being of the child, and children have amazing antennas. Even very young children who can't speak or can't understand long explanations, they can pick up where it's coming from. They might always not smile and say, yeah, you're fantastic. I know you mean my well-being. So of course I want to have the candy now. No, they might actually throw a tantrum, but it doesn't matter. It's a long-term effect. As long as it's coming from the right place, as long as it's coming from your love. I think this is the issue. You see, sometimes parents know that they have to love and love and love. And the way they understand that is, that means I never say no. I can't say no. I can't be firm. That's what I'm talking about. In other words, that doesn't breed strong children. That breeds entitled children, right? So that's why that combination is so important, it's so critical.
Thank you. That's well answered. Thank you very much. Let's move on to a hot button topic. And because it's a hot button topic, and I've read a lot about it, and I've spoken to a lot of people that struggle with it, and thought about it a lot. So you're going to forgive me if the question is a little bit long-winded. And this is the area of technology. So here's my rant. The Rebbe didn't like the concept of labels. When it comes to Jews, Reform, Orthodox, this and that and the other. For purposes of this discussion, I'm going to use labels, and I'm going to divide the Orthodox world into the ultra-Orthodox and the modern Orthodox. And it's my contention that the ultra-Orthodox world has done themselves, and more importantly, the modern Orthodox world, a disservice by the way they have presented the ills of the internet and electronic usage. There was a major gathering some years ago called the Internet Asifa, and the discussion was really about obscenities, obscene material, violence, and so on. The kind of material where a religious boy or girl should not have access to, and so on. And in truth, the more I think about it, the lost opportunity was that really has nothing to do with that, or less to do with being exposed to inappropriate material, but rather it has to do with emotional well-being. Especially with girls and body image, with, the amount of time spent on the internet, on electronics, a lack of connection. I want to mention one of my favorite books, Lost Connections by Johan Hari. And the result was that they were kind of preaching to the choir, because within the ultra-Orthodox groups, so those that were doing it anyways, they kind of listened and they continued doing what they were supposed to do. The rebels didn't listen. On the modern Orthodox, on the flip side, I know that even from the best of educators in school, they said, "Oh, that's for the frummer. That's for the but our students, our children who are 13, 14 years old, everyone can handle a smartphone successfully." And in truth, it was not the case, as I've observed in the years since I've been observing this. Now, although I've read a lot about some studies about this, although there's not, we talk about causation and correlation, there's definitely a correlation between between the ills of the internet and electronic usage and mental health, I don't think the studies are conclusive about causation. In other words, it's not like a scientific study that has been done that can definitively say we have mental health. This is the reason. Internet. I mean, there's obviously other reasons, but whether the internet causes it, we know there's correlation. That we do know. I'll just end off this question by telling you that I was interviewed for a documentary by a British psychotherapist by the name of Dr. Raj Prasad. He told me the following, and this is someone who's both a psychologist and a psychiatrist, who told me, he used the word dismiss, that young people up until the age of 25, he told me, are unable to absorb that which is good from the internet and to dismiss that which is bad. So I think this is we're in the throes of this right now. We don't really kind of realize what the ills that it's doing to ourselves and to our young children as they grow up, both in terms of access to inappropriate material, the lack of human connection, and all the other things that go along with that. So I think psychologists talk about this ad nauseum, and we can go on and on about that. But let's talk about this from a Torah perspective / mental health. What role does it play, and what is the messaging about internet, electronic usage, social media, and so on?
Okay, that's a huge question, and I'm happy you're bringing it up, and I'm happy we're talking about it. I've personally, in the last number of years particularly, started to talk about it a lot in my parenting sessions, and dealing with, again, from a prevention perspective, dealing with parents and the usage of their children with technology. And I think you're right. I'm not doing it so much from obviously it has a very big religious component to it, but it's not just a religious component. It's much deeper than that, much broader than that. We have everyone likes to talk about a pandemic today, but now there's a new strain of the virus. I'm in isolation now because I came from South Africa last week, but there's a much bigger pandemic, and that is the pandemic of, I won't say technology, but misuse of technology. Technology essentially is a good thing. I can't really comment on the communities in America, and each one has their own hashkafa and their own ways of doing things. But the way I see it, particularly dealing over here in Australia, I've talked about it here in Sydney and in Melbourne particularly, is the horse is bolted. I mean, 99.9% of families are all exposed to technology. It's not a matter of should we have technology or not. Everyone has it. Everyone's exposed to it. It's a matter now of managing it, right? Now, before I address this question, I want to just finish off with the last question because it's going to be relevant to this question as well. Anyone that really wants to take seriously the strategies that are used with their children is going to have to have a look at their own modeling as well, right? I know it's a cliche, but it's critical. You simply cannot teach values unless you're prepared to make changes in your own life, right? It's as simple as that. And there's a word that I once saw about the kruvim on the Aron HaKodesh. So the kruvim, we know, had faces of children, right? And the Aron was made miksha achas. It was made out of one piece of gold, which Moshe Rabbeinu had difficulty with, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to throw the Aron into fire and so on. But the Mefarshim explained that the kruvim itself also was miksha achas, also came from one piece of gold. And the lesson behind that is that it's all one formula, it's all one journey. Parents and children have to become one journey. And if parents want to take this seriously, the well-being of their child, the emotional well-being of the child, and the religious well-being of the child, and every other aspect of well-being of the child, we have to also look at our own consistency, our own authenticity, our own mixed messages or clarity of messages, and our own modeling and things, and our own behavior, right? Which is true in all the things we mentioned before, whether it's self-control or indulgence or materialism or pursuit of pleasure, whatever the case might be, but it's also particularly relevant to the area of technology and how it affects children. There's a lot of resistance to confront this, but the reality is that there's, as you know yourself and as you've discovered over the last years, you've shared that with me many times, and I know this from talking to lots of different people, there's terrible stuff that is happening as a result of misuse of technology, and it needs to be addressed. And the only way I think it can be addressed, well, I'm not talking about once the crisis is there, because obviously then it's a different response, but in terms of prevention, we need to start very, very young. So let's just go through the issues very briefly. Obviously, this is a very long discussion, but let's try and go through the issues very briefly, and I'll share with you my perspective and what I've been telling parents. Right? The harm of technology is multiply layered. It's not even about inappropriate material, though it is about inappropriate material. Obviously, it brings addiction. There's a lot of pornography, a much higher percentage. There should be a pornography addiction within the religious world. That's a fact. Some people don't like to notice it, but it's there. Addiction to pornography is not a religious issue. It's a functional issue. People become dysfunctional from it. People become depressed from it. Mental health is affected. The whole relationships are harmed because they have a whole warped perception of what intimacy is supposed to look like. There are so many different effects of addiction, or screen addiction in general, but pornography addiction in particular. Even if there's not addiction, overuse of screen is bad for people. You know, there are studies out there that the levels of empathy, which empathy, by the way, is a critical component of any relationship, has dropped dramatically. There's a documented study, which I saw in one of Dr. Popoulos' books actually, which is an amazing study of how levels of empathy has actually dropped since smartphones have come into being, right? Because people have stopped noticing other people. They're on their phones all the time. They're on the screen all the time. They don't have human interaction. They don't communicate properly. They're not aware of what's going on around them. They become very absorbed in their own bubble. Warped realities of what things are supposed to look like social media, where you have distorted pictures and photoshopped images and very false images of what couples look like and what bliss looks like and what happiness looks like, where, you know, the couples that come into, I mean, it's an amazing thing. I mean, I use social media because I use it for my organization particularly, and I've seen people post things where I've canceled those people. I know what's going on behind closed doors, and they create this image of being the most amazingly happy people on screen, creating envy, creating insecurity, and it's just unbelievable. So there's so much harm, and we're very tempted, particularly from a very young age, to use technology as a babysitter. We put kids in front of a screen. Often it's about, because it's kosher, it's okay, it's Uncle Moshe videos, it's this music, it's that. Really, excessive screen time is bad for you. It's documented. It's a terrible thing. And then as they get older, then it becomes much more serious. So I think, and again, what I'm sharing with you is not a chiddush, but I just think it's not spoken about enough. That's why I'm passionately speaking about it. I think that the way to begin is with two things. Parents, number one, have to be parents. And it's very difficult sometimes because you're up against a lot of social pressure. Every parent will know that their fourth grader comes in and says, why can't I have a smartphone? Every child in my class has one. And that's where it begins. And from there it just evolves, and one thing leads to another. So we have to, number one, be parents and be strong, respectfully, nicely, positively, but be strong. But more importantly is, as children do become exposed to technology, which is inevitable in most societies, most primitive societies even, we need to begin to have conversations. And those conversations with our children have to be multiple and often, right? And the conversations have to...
In other words, what you're saying is conceding that it's here to stay.
It's here to stay.
How do we deal with it?
But we have to have conversations, and those conversations have to focus in two areas. One is they have to be around the values that we hold dear. In other words, children, as they get older, need to understand why it could be very dangerous for them. That's important, particularly as they get a bit older. You know, I said before that 5-year-olds don't need to know the reason for everything, but as they get older, nowadays particularly, maybe it is important to have those conversations and to explain it, even though they might not understand it properly. But it's important to talk about values. When you transmit any values, really, it's important to talk about it, and talk about it with passion, and talk about it repeatedly. And those conversations have to be around guidelines and boundaries. So I think as soon as you notice, or even before you notice, this could be even after you notice that your child is too exposed to, or too much on the phone, or too much on the iPad, or too much on the laptop, whatever the case is. But maybe even more importantly, before that happens, we need to have conversations with our children that go something like this. They have to be respectful, calm conversations, but assertive. Things like, we need to communicate things to children like, I'm responsible for your well-being, right? Things I ask you to do or I prevent you from doing, you don't always like, but it's for your well-being, and I promise you, I will never do something that's not in your interest, right? You need to acknowledge to children that temptation is normal, right? It's a very important thing. Kids grow up and they have temptation. They have temptation to look at things they shouldn't look at. They have temptation to engage in things they shouldn't engage in, and that needs to be acknowledged, and it's normal. But as a parent, my job is to guide you. My job is to ensure that you are engaging in safe behavior, right? That takes time. Temptation is normal, and the desire to engage is normal, and the skill to engage positively and responsibly is important. The analogy I always give is a car. I'm not going to give you my car to drive. Cars are very good things, and they can do amazing, and they can accomplish amazing things, but when you're too young, you don't have a license because you're not responsible enough to drive properly. Same thing with technology. Technology is not bad. It's a good thing. We know that today in the Torah world, the amount of Torah that is accessible, I mean, I use it in my own organization. The amount of learning that is done online and through technology is amazing, but you have to have the skill to do it. And that comes with age, and it comes with maturity. So therefore, you tell the child, this is the conversation we're going to have. And I want you to be part of the conversation. And I want you to share your feelings. But you need to know that I'm the parent, and I'm going to make some of the decisions, and we're going to make some changes. If it's already too much, we're going to make some changes, or we're going to set some guidelines. Now, part of that conversation has to be about some of the pitfalls, some of the weaknesses, or some of the dangers of technology. But then we have to have conversations around boundaries, and they have to be respectful, but they have to be assertive. We shouldn't be scared. We have to have conversations with empathy. We have to acknowledge the struggles, and we have to have interactive conversations. We have to listen to them as well. We have to listen to why they want. I want to tell you something. Like, for example, over here, and there's a big problem where some parents want to limit the use of technology for their children in a positive way, and then their fifth grader will come and say, "Well, I don't know anything that's going on in my class," and sometimes legitimate, by the way, because there's a WhatsApp group in the class, and they get left out. They get completely left out because they don't know what's going on because that parent doesn't want them to have WhatsApp, which I think is legitimate, right? So we'll talk about how to deal with that, but this is all in the context of how we began this discussion. This is critical because this will have a direct input on the emotional, psychological, and mental health, and religious and spiritual well-being of a child as they grow older. So let's just, again, this is a conversation in its own right about the type of boundaries, but things like, you say to the child, right, I'm the parent. So when the time comes, I am going to get you a smartphone if you need, but there's going to be guidelines. You can't have it all day and all night. Parents, I know parents that that at night, their child goes to sleep with a smartphone, has unfettered access to everything. It's unbelievably dangerous. That just can't happen, right? Not as an 8-year-old, not as a 15-year-old even. So there needs to be a look at filters, and there's a lot of people that can advise on that thing. There needs to be people do research on the internet for homework and things like that. That can be done in a public place. A child should never be on a laptop in their own room doing their own stuff. And not that we need to do that secretly. We need to talk about it. We need to explain to them, this is gonna be the Seder, this is gonna be the boundaries. There has to be an open door policy. I'm happy for you to work on the laptop, but I'm not happy for me to come into the room and for you to suddenly close the laptop. I want to be able to check your history. I want to be able to know what's going on. There are very good filters out there. There are very good monitoring systems, and so on and so forth. I'm just giving a couple of examples. Obviously, these conversations are long and involved. What I am saying is that the conversation needs to begin. My feeling is, my experience is, the parents are hiding, they're escaping, they don't want to have the conversation because it's a difficult conversation. Because yes, there's pushback, yes, there's tantrums sometimes, yes, there's all my friends do it, why are you the only one, etc., etc. We need to be parents, we need to do it calmly, never take the bait of a tantrum. We need to do it positively, we need to always emphasize this for the good of the child. I think very importantly also, we need as parents to build alliances with other parents. They're doing that now in New York. I know there's a whole organization called, I think it's called MUST or something, right, which is delaying children, parents getting together and from not from the school, not from the institutions, but parents themselves building strong alliances together. So children, as young as 8 can't say, well, my parents say, well, they don't, because there's 10 parents who got together and they've decided.
Shout out to my cousin, Rabbi Moti Lipsker, who's very involved.
He's involved in Crown Heights, I think, in the Crown Heights chapter of it, right? Yeah. Which is a great. So it's all that thing. However, I need to go back to the way I started this particular segment of our conversation. that in order to do this, parents are going to have a very hard look at the way they use technology themselves. You cannot have this conversation with children and sit at a dinner table looking at your iPhone, right? It just can't happen. You can't be secretive about what you're looking. Obviously, we need to have our own boundaries. We need to make sure that we have self-control. Some of us become addicted to our iPhone, not such terrible stuff sometimes, but nevertheless addicted. We're always checking our WhatsApp. We think the world's going to fall apart if we haven't checked the last message in the last 7 minutes, right? So we need to look at our own modeling, and we need to share with children our own world. Sometimes we need to say to our children, you know, I think I've been a little bit too much on my own phone. I'm going to now, when I come home, I'm going to actually put away my phone and I'm going to sit with you, and I'm not going to actually open my phone for another hour and a half, even to check my emails, right? And share with children how it's not easy for you either. We need to model that effort to children. So in short answer to your question, I think technology is a very, very important discussion in the context of prevention of mental health, particularly, and religious health and every other form of well-being. And conversations need to begin. Parents need to find the strength not to be afraid and to engage positively. If they don't know how to do it, they need to reach out. There's help out there. People can help them. People can advise them. But it's something that every single parent in today's age, I think, needs to take very seriously.
Thank you. To follow up on that on a practical level, let's talk about cell phone policy in high schools and Beit Midrashim and seminaries post-high school. And the reason I'm asking that is because what I'm finding here in New York is what's going on, that a lot of the very frum schools are saying you can't have a smartphone, only what they call a dumb phone. And what inevitably takes place is that every girl and boy have two phones. One's a smartphone and one's a dumb phone. One they show to the teacher, one they keep in their bag. And the parents know about it, by the way. So, and to me, it's like, it just kind of shows that the policy doesn't work. Saying we're tarnished, we can't do it. We have to kind of recognize, like you said, it's here to stay, and educate our young about proper usage of the internet. But just on a very practical level, what would you, if you're a principal of a high school, I think you were once, right? But before
pre-phone days.
Pre-phone days, right? If you're a principal of a high school, you know, what rules would you put in place for to prevent this very thing of having a dumb phone and a smartphone secretly, which we all know there are things that are private, but then there are things that are secret, which are just terrible.
So I'm going to answer that question a little bit differently because look, it's a hard one. I think every school has a different community, different expectations. It's a very, very complicated thing. I know some schools, what they do is they allow, over here in New Wales, they allow children to have smartphones because that's what they have anyway, and they don't want to go through that sort of secretive process, but they actually have to hand in their phones when they come to school because there's a general policy that there shouldn't be distractions during the day. So if they don't have phones during the day, but when at the end they can pick up their phone and leave it to the parents to guide the children about kind of phone. But I want to share with you a thought that just came to mind, which I wrote an article about this once, and I remember doing this because I really believe in this. And this I remember once in Australia, there's a big problem in the non-Jewish schools and or non-religious schools even about children engaging in alcohol and substance abuse, whatever the case is, right? So, and they keep on doing stuff which is clearly not working. So they bring in these lecturers to keep on talking about the dangers of drugs or the dangers of alcohol, the dangers of this, the dangers of that, and it's clearly not working. So they had this great chachma one day. I heard on the radio. I was driving in the car, where they were contemplating raising the age, the legal limit of drinking, from 18 to 21, like they do in America. And I thought, that's really dumb because it's not working in America, and it's definitely not going to work here either, right? It's not working, the age limit. I mean, you got to be naive to think that children who want to drink can find a way around it, right? All these legal limits, all they do is it makes harder for the organizers of events. It's okay, so you're 20 and you're not 21, so I can't offer you a l'chaim or whatever the case is, that kind of thing. It's not doing anything for the child, really, right? So I wrote an article and I said it's not the drink, it's the chocolate. What I mean by that is children need their own internal gauge. The children need a sense of decision making, a pause. In other words, there's the famous it's based on Viktor Frankl and so on. The pause between stimulus and response, right? Part of the world that we live in today is this immediate, impulsive response to everything. Children grow up with a lack of ability to actually hold back on things that are tempting, right? where you build that mechanism to hold back and just to think for a second and say, well, I don't necessarily need to jump into what I want to do, is not when they're 18 in high school, or when they're 21 in yeshiva, or when they're 12 in a high school, right? Or in a preschool, whatever the case is. You build it very, very young age. There's that famous, I don't remember who did the study, but the famous marshmallow experiment. It's a famous experiment they did with young children, where they put some children in a room together and they put a marshmallow, and they told them that if you eat the marshmallow, that's okay, but if you don't eat it for 15 minutes, we'll give you 2 marshmallows. And they went out the room and just left these 5-year-olds, and some had more natural self-control than others. And it was actually, it's a very, very funny video. And some just sort of looked at it, and they tracked these children throughout their life, and they saw the ones that have an eternal ability for self-control, or the ones that were much more effective and successful and well-rounded and so on. But we need to build that self-control. It doesn't start when they're in yeshiva. I mean, look, sometimes rules have to be made for whatever reason, have to be made, and I'm not going to comment on that. But if you want it to be successful, it's the 5-year-old you got to start with. It's building that strength, that inner sense of decision-making, self-control, Kabbalah's oil, as we call it in the typical literature, from when they're very, very young, in a strong, beautiful, and nurturing way, but yet in a firm way.
Thank you. I have a final question before we wrap this up, and that is, are you optimistic about the future of, I hate this term mental health awareness. I mean, we're all aware. Question is, we're doing anything about it? Are you optimistic for for future?
I'm optimistic because
the medium term and the far term.
Yeah, I'm concerned. I think we need to react. I think we need to do a lot more in the area of prevention. But I'm optimistic because we also believe, right? We're Torah Jews, or we believe in what Torah tells us, or we believe in Ma'at Oyer Doicha Harba Min HaChoshech. We're recording this on Hanukkah, so we know that Hanukkah is about one small flame, not a big flame, one small flame, one little candle each night. As long as there's one more candle each night, that's the idea. And I think we shouldn't overwhelm ourselves. I think every person that's listening to this, or every person that is involved in thinking about these concepts, just needs to do that little bit. If it's parents, they should do it for their own children. Take it seriously. It might be, as a response, it might be just being more aware of people around us, reaching out to people, finding out how they are. We know there's so many stories of people just that, not every story works, but we know that lots of stories about people who were helped just by someone caring about them, just someone looking out for them, someone telephoning them and just saying, how you doing? I haven't seen you for a while. In terms of prevention, just little steps. I'm saying with parents, when I said about technology, for example, starting the conversation, you're not going to get it right overnight. You're not going to get it right away, but just keep doing it. It said in the name of the Rebbe Rashab, and I read once that the Chafetz Chaim said a very similar thing, and that is that parents need to spend half an hour each day about the chinuch of their children, right? Before I had kids, I didn't understand. I thought it was an exaggeration, half an hour each day. Sometimes I think maybe half an hour isn't enough. The concept here is just spend time thinking about it. Go to another parenting lecture. I know when I was a parent of young children, I'm a bit beyond that now, but I used to love to go to parenting lectures, even if I learned nothing new, because every time I went, there was just an energy again. I would think about it again and try maybe something new, or try revisit something that I've forgotten about. We just need to keep thinking about it and keep doing little bits, keep adding one Hanukkah candle, and we have to believe that Ma'at Oyer Doicha Harba Min HaChoshech, and we'll push away lots of darkness with a little bits of light.
Alrighty. Well, I want to thank you for doing this. This has been fascinating. And I want to thank Tzvi Glak and Amodim for giving us the opportunity to have this very important discussion. And I wish you much hatzlacha in the important work that you're doing. I wish much hatzlacha to Amodim and the important work that they're doing. And we should all hear good news in this area.
Amen. Thank you. And thank you for doing this. It's been a pleasure. I also want to just echo that thanks to the organizers of this event and to Amodim. I haven't been involved with Amodim that much, but I've gone on the web and I've looked at a lot of their stuff, and obviously doing very important work, both in responding to crises and in prevention. And I wish them lots of hatzlacha.
Okay. Thank you.